Karen had no idea what she was getting into when she casually spread the word about my free buffet. Everyone thought it was going to be a typical feast, mouth-watering dishes and a fun time with friends. But little did they know, I had something far more fiery and chaotic in store. As soon as the first bite hit, the room erupted. The heat was unbearable, and the chaos was just beginning. Karen, the one who thought she could ruin my reputation, was about to learn the hard way that there's more to a meal than just food. Stay with me till the end to see how I turned the tables and served up a brutal lesson she'll never forget. It all started with Karen. If there was one person in the neighborhood who had an overinflated sense of her own importance, it was her. She was the self-appointed queen of the community, always making sure that everyone knew what was happening in the neighborhood, and even more importantly, what she thought should happen. It was as if she believed she had the power to dictate what everyone should do and how they should behave. It wasn't that she was officially in charge of anything, but she certainly acted like it. No one could escape the reach of her self-assigned authority, and it often rubbed people the wrong way, though no one ever said it to her face. But when Karen made a claim, it wasn't just a suggestion. It was a demand wrapped in a shiny, polite bow. One afternoon, I found out that Karen had started telling everyone in the neighborhood about a free buffet I was hosting at my house. At first, I thought it was a joke, but as the days passed, I realized that it wasn't. Karen had been casually dropping the news in conversations with neighbors, mentioning it at the grocery store and even on the neighborhood's online forum. Word had spread like wildfire, and soon it felt like everyone in the community knew about the free buffet that I had supposedly organized. The problem? I hadn't agreed to host a buffet, let alone a free one. In fact, I hadn't even discussed it with anyone, let alone with Karen. When I finally caught wind of this, I reached out to Karen, hoping to clear up the misunderstanding. But true to her form, Karen brushed off my concerns with a casual laugh. "Oh, don't worry about it," she said, her voice dripping with faux reassurance. "Everyone's so excited. It'll be great. I told them you were the perfect host, and they can't wait to come over. You're going to love all the attention you're getting. You'll be the talk of the neighborhood." She said it like it was some kind of honor. It wasn't just a casual suggestion. It was an expectation she had set, one that I had never agreed to. I stood there in shock, trying to comprehend how this all spiraled out of control without my consent. Karen had not only promised a buffet at my house, but she had also made me the central figure in a plan that I had no part in. Her confidence in casually volunteering my home without asking was astonishing, and what was worse, she made it seem like a favor to me. To her, this was an opportunity for me to shine, to gain the adoration of the community. She was practically framing it as a public service I owed them, as if I was obliged to cater to everyone just because she had decided it was a good idea. And yet, despite my frustration, Karen's forceful confidence made it hard to back out. I'm not someone who usually seeks the spotlight. I like keeping a low profile, focusing on my work, and spending time with my close friends. I had never been one for attention or for large social gatherings. But now, Karen had created this massive event in my name. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this was her way of asserting dominance. This wasn't about kindness or community spirit. It was about her using my home and my time for her own satisfaction. She was positioning herself as a kind of neighborhood influencer, as if the event was for my benefit, but really it was all about making her feel like she was in control. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I was cornered. People were already buzzing about it, and I couldn't back out without looking like the bad guy. Everyone would think I was rude or ungrateful. I could already hear the whispers. "Oh, she didn't even want to host the buffet? How strange." I could already picture Karen standing by, making her usual passive-aggressive remarks about how I was the one who didn't want to welcome the neighborhood into my home. So, I decided to play along. But there was no way I was going to let Karen have her way this time. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this might just be my chance to turn the tables. If she thought this was going to be a smooth, carefree gathering, she had another thing coming. I had been silently planning something of my own. What started as a reluctant compliance with Karen's plans would soon turn into my opportunity to take control of the situation. I was going to show her just how unpredictable things could get. I wasn't going to be the one embarrassed at my own event. It was time for a little payback, a chance to serve up something far hotter than anyone expected, something that would make them question their assumptions. Karen thought she could dictate my actions, but she was about to learn that I had something much more chaotic in mind than a simple buffet. I smiled to myself, silently preparing for the chaos that would soon unfold. I knew one thing for sure. Karen had no idea what she was truly walking into. The buffet was going to be much more than anyone expected, and I was ready to serve up a lesson she'd never forget. What started as her attempt to embarrass me was about to turn into a lesson on why you should never underestimate someone who has had enough. As the evening drew closer, the anticipation in the air was almost palpable. The neighborhood was abuzz, with excitement about Karen's free buffet, and even though I hadn't exactly planned for it, there was a certain charm to the evening that began to grow on me. The guests arrived one by one, all wearing smiles, eager to indulge in what they thought would be a simple, fun evening. The sounds of cheerful chatter filled the air, mingled with laughter and the clinking of glasses. People from all corners of the community, many of whom I barely knew, trickled in, some with their families and others with friends in tow. I could see the excitement in their eyes as they caught wind of the food on the buffet table, and the mood was light-hearted. Everyone was looking forward to what Karen had promised them, a night of good food and good company. I watched the guests pile their plates high with appetizers and sides, their chatter growing louder as they dug into the generous spread. The buffet was laid out beautifully, everything from salads to dips and hot dishes filling every available space on the table. I had to admit, despite the circumstances, the food did look amazing. But while everyone else was distracted by the abundance of dishes in front of them, I knew something they didn't. The heat of the night, the real challenge, was waiting to make its entrance. Underneath the surface of all this excitement, there was a deep sense of satisfaction within me. Karen, the one who had started this whole mess by volunteering me as the host, was floating around, basking in the attention, talking about how wonderful it was to have the entire neighborhood over at my place. She kept mentioning how perfect the evening was turning out, how everyone was loving the food, and how they were all so impressed with the generosity of the buffet. She couldn't help herself. She was soaking in the limelight, certain that this was all part of her master plan. But little did she know, this wasn't the night she was going to shine. As I watched her mingle and pat herself on the back for organizing this so-called perfect evening, I couldn't help but smirk. The wheels in my head were turning. I had spent the last few days quietly preparing a surprise that no one was expecting. Among the many dishes on display, there was one in particular that stood out, the infamous ghost pepper wings. It was my secret weapon, the challenge I had been quietly preparing for the evening. No one, not even Karen, had any idea what was in store for them. It wasn't just about serving food. It was about serving up something so fiery and intense that it would rattle everyone's nerves, turning what should have been a pleasant dinner into an unforgettable moment of chaos. I knew the ghost pepper wings would be the highlight of the night. These weren't your average spicy wings. They were made with the hottest pepper known to man, something that could make even the toughest stomachs tremble with fear. I'd seen the reactions from people who had dared to eat them before, faces turning bright red, eyes watering, mouths on fire, and in some cases, people scrambling for water or milk to cool their burning throats. The heat was so intense that it had a way of overwhelming the senses, leaving people stunned and unable to think clearly for a few moments. And that's exactly what I wanted to happen. The calm of the evening was fleeting, and I could feel it. As I prepared the last of the ghost pepper wings, I took a deep breath, savoring the satisfaction of knowing what was coming. The wings were carefully plated and added to the table, mixed in among the other dishes as if they were just another ordinary appetizer. There was no fanfare, no big reveal, just a subtle placement of the most dangerous food on the table. And, as Karen continued to parade around, basking in the attention, she had no clue that the real drama was about to unfold right under her nose. The guests didn't suspect a thing. They were still caught up in the jovial atmosphere, laughing, chatting, and enjoying the food without giving much thought to anything beyond their plates. The intoxicating aroma of the food filled the air, and the clatter of forks and knives seemed to drown out any lingering thoughts of what might happen next. It was the perfect moment for a surprise, and I could feel the excitement building within me. The calm before the storm was exactly what I needed. It gave me time to watch, to plan, and to savor the coming chaos. Soon enough, the first few guests began to notice the wings. "Hey, look at these," someone said, pointing to the plate of wings drenched in a sauce that was a deep, fiery red. The curious crowd started gathering around the table, drawn in by the bold appearance of the wings. "Who made these?" One guest asked, eyeing them with intrigue. Karen, who was still basking in the attention, puffed up her chest proudly and announced, "I'm sure these are from the chef's special recipe. He really knows how to deliver." The guests hesitated for a moment, unsure if they should take a bite. It wasn't until Karen eagerly grabbed one, proudly biting into the wing, that the others followed suit. The moment she took the first bite, I could see the shift in her expression. Her face froze for a split second, and then, in an instant, her eyes widened. She tried to keep her composure, but the fiery heat had already started to take over. Her mouth twisted, and she reached for a glass of water, but it only made things worse. That was when the chaos began. The guests, who had been cautiously watching, began to follow suit, and soon the room was filled with coughing, gasping for air, and frantic scrambling for relief. The fiery storm I had been planning had begun. As the first round of reactions spread like wildfire through the room, I stood back, watching the chaos unfold, with a smile creeping across my face. This was it. The storm had arrived, and Karen, the one who thought she could control everything, was now the center of a very different kind of attention. What was meant to be a calm, cheerful evening had suddenly turned into a wild, uncontrollable frenzy, and I had orchestrated it all. The moment the first guest took a bite of the ghost pepper wings, it was as if the atmosphere in the room shifted, instantaneously. Up until that point, the evening had been filled with the sounds of light chatter, clinking glasses, and the buzz of a friendly gathering. The guests, unaware of the fiery storm about to hit, had been happily munching on appetizers and enjoying the food Karen had assured them was the highlight of the night. But as soon as the first bite of those deceptively innocent-looking wings was consumed, everything changed. The room seemed to freeze for a split second, and then the chaos erupted. It began with the first victim, a guest who had innocently taken a wing, his face lighting up as he tasted the crisp, spicy exterior. For a brief moment, there was silence, but then his expression shifted dramatically. His eyes widened, his lips tinged with a panicked flush, and his face contorted as if he had bitten into something far hotter than he was prepared for. Within seconds, he gasped for air, his hand shooting up to his mouth as he scrambled for water. It was a wild reaction that set off a chain reaction throughout the room. One by one, more guests followed, each of them taking a bite and quickly realizing they had just made a grave mistake. The heat spread like wildfire, faces turned red, eyes watered uncontrollably, and the room seemed to shake with the sudden chaotic energy of people desperately trying to cool their burning throats. Karen, who had been walking around proudly, enjoying the spotlight as if she had orchestrated a perfect evening, was the first to fall victim to the wing's wrath. I watched as she confidently grabbed a wing, her usual smug smile in place as she bit into it. But that smile vanished almost immediately. Her face twisted in shock and agony, and her eyes began to water uncontrollably. It was as if a switch had been flipped. The once confident Karen, who had so eagerly taken credit for organizing this event, was now frantically fanning her mouth, gasping for breath. She stumbled backward, clutching her throat, her hands flailing as she searched for something, anything, to put out the fire raging in her mouth. The guests, who had been hesitantly sampling the wings, started to panic. The sounds of coughing and gagging filled the air, each person realizing they had just crossed a line they couldn't uncross. Some tried to grab for the milk, but the jug was knocked over in the frenzy, spilling everywhere. Others grabbed slices of bread, desperately trying to soothe the unbearable burn. The chaos was spiraling out of control. People were rushing to the sink, slamming their hands on the counter, and running for anything they thought might bring some relief. But nothing worked. Nothing could cool the sheer intensity of the heat from the ghost peppers. The room, which had been filled with laughter and lightheartedness just moments ago, was now filled with the sounds of panicked desperation. One person grabbed a bottle of olive oil and began sipping it as if it were a lifesaver, while another tried to eat a whole loaf of bread in one go. I couldn't help but laugh quietly to myself. This was the moment I had been waiting for. Karen, the woman who had been so sure of herself, who had thought she could control every detail of this event, was now the victim of her own arrogance. She had created the perfect setup for her own downfall, and I was relishing in every second of it. Amidst the madness, there were those who began to see the humor in the situation. It wasn't long before the room erupted into fits of laughter, despite the discomfort. People were laughing at the absurdity of the chaos unfolding before them. There was something so comical about watching grown adults, some of whom prided themselves on their ability to handle heat, desperately flailing about in search of relief. The humor in the situation became a kind of unspoken bond among the guests. Even Karen, despite her obvious distress, couldn't help but let out a nervous laugh between gasps for air. She had no choice but to admit that this was far beyond her control. She had underestimated the challenge I had set up, and now she was paying the price. As the minutes ticked by, the chaos began to settle, though not in the way anyone had hoped. The initial shock of the wings' fiery heat was slowly replaced with an overwhelming sense of defeat. People were starting to regain their composure, but their faces were still flushed, their eyes still watering, and their stomachs likely churning from the sudden shock of the spices. The room had gone from frantic to exhausted as guests leaned against counters, nursing the after effects of the hottest wings they had ever eaten. Some of them were even whispering among themselves, talking about how they had underestimated the spice and vowing never to take such a risk again. Karen, who had initially thought this buffet would solidify her place as the neighborhood's organizer, now found herself standing in the middle of the chaos, the object of everyone's attention, for all the wrong reasons. As she caught her breath and wiped her eyes, I couldn't help but notice the shift in her posture. The confident Karen who had pranced around, organizing and bragging about the evening, was now the humbled woman who had just learned a very public lesson about the consequences of underestimating the power of what she had set in motion. The tables had turned, and the evening she had hoped would be all about her was now about something completely different. The laughter and chaos slowly turned into murmurs of discomfort and disbelief, but the damage had been done. Karen was no longer the talk of the evening. Instead, the ghost pepper wings had become the centerpiece of the night, and she was the unwitting star of the show. The very buffet she had helped to promote had become the thing that would haunt her for much longer than any of us could have anticipated. The first bite had triggered it all, the fiery surprise that no one had expected but everyone would remember. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from one of lighthearted fun to utter chaos in a matter of minutes. What had once been an evening of casual dining and socializing had now transformed into a battle for survival as the searing heat of the ghost pepper wings took hold. As more and more guests took their first fateful bites, The situation spiraled completely out of control. The discomfort was immediate and intense. What started as small gasps for air quickly escalated into frantic, desperate actions as people scrambled to find any sort of relief. The usual civility of dinner parties was nowhere to be found now. People were too consumed by the fire raging inside their mouths to care about manners or decorum. Some guests had already bolted for the door, driven by a need to escape the suffocating heat in their throats. One woman, her face contorted in pain, sprinted towards the backyard, hoping the cool night air would soothe her burning mouth. Others were huddled around the sink, gulping down cold water in an effort to put out the fire, but their desperate attempts were in vain. Water only made the burn worse, turning the flames of discomfort into a raging inferno. Some tried the only other option they thought might work, milk, but when the jug was knocked over in the chaos, people were left helpless, caught in an uncontrollable panic. A few guests even grabbed handfuls of bread, stuffing it into their mouths in a futile attempt to absorb the heat, but nothing seemed to work. The sound of coughing, gagging, and frantic gasps filled the air, creating an almost surreal atmosphere. The chaos was no longer just about the food, it was about survival. The situation had gone from bad to worse, with people becoming disoriented and losing all sense of control. It was like watching a stampede, but in slow motion, as everyone scrambled to find relief, bumping into one another and bumping into furniture. The room was filled with the scent of sweat, panic, and hot sauce, an odd mix of sensory overload. The guests, who had once been so poised and confident, now found themselves humbled by the very thing they had eagerly chosen to eat. As the chaos unfolded, one person stood out more than the others: Karen. She had been the one to boast about this, Buffett to call attention to my so-called generosity in hosting this event. She was the one who had spread the word to every neighbor, believing this would be her moment to shine, to be praised for organizing the perfect evening. Now, though, Karen was at the center of the storm, and not in the way she had imagined. She was no longer the charming hostess or the proud figure leading the festivities. She was the subject of mockery, the punchline of a joke that had backfired spectacularly. As Karen clutched her throat, her face flushed red, the realization of her predicament began to sink in. She had become the laughingstock of the evening, and it was impossible for her to regain the sense of control she had once commanded. Her eyes watered, her cheeks reddened, and her breath came in short, gasping spurts. The prideful woman who had strutted around, convinced that this buffet was a reflection of her ability to bring the neighborhood together, now found herself struggling to keep her composure. In a scene that would have been funny in any other context, Karen was now frantically moving from one corner of the room to another, trying to find something, anything, to ease the fire in her mouth. The guests, who were still managing to stand upright, couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of the situation. No one had expected the night to take such a wild turn. What had started as an event filled with excitement and expectation had turned into something chaotic and hysterical. People who had been eagerly awaiting a night of good food and good conversation were now reduced to helpless individuals, each fighting their own battle with the intensity of the ghost pepper heat. The laughter that filled the room wasn't out of humor at the spice itself. It was a nervous, almost giddy reaction to the complete absurdity of what had happened. For Karen, it was the moment of reckoning. She had walked into my home with confidence, sure that this event would boost her status and make her the center of attention. Instead, she became the center of ridicule. Every time she stumbled across the room, gasping for breath, people couldn't help but chuckle. It was ironic. This woman who prided herself on control, who had tried so hard to manipulate the situation into her favor, was now the victim of her own overconfidence. I had orchestrated this perfectly, and in a way that nobody, least of all Karen, had seen coming. I could hear Karen muttering to herself as she wiped her eyes, her voice shaky with embarrassment and discomfort. "This wasn't supposed to happen," she said under her breath, but it was too late for that. The damage had been done. What was supposed to be a fun evening of mingling and eating had now become an unforgettable disaster, and Karen had unwittingly set herself up as the star of a show that no one would ever forget. The evening had taken an unexpected turn. The chaos unleashed by the ghost Pepperwings had upended the narrative Karen had hoped to control. Instead of being remembered as the gracious host of a perfect buffet, Karen was now the one everyone would be talking about. Except this time, it wouldn't be for her hospitality or her ability to organize. It would be for the fiery chaos that had turned her into the laughingstock of the neighborhood, and no one could ignore the irony of it all. My plan was unfolding perfectly, and as I looked around at the group of frantic, sweating guests, I couldn't help but feel a surge of satisfaction. This was my revenge, served up on a platter, hotter than anyone could have anticipated. By the time the evening came to a close, the air was thick with tension, a strange mix of lingering discomfort from the intense heat and the slowly dawning realization of what had just transpired. What started as an innocent evening had spiraled into one of the most chaotic, unpredictable events anyone in the neighborhood had ever experienced. Guests were finally starting to recover, though their faces were still flushed, their movements sluggish as they stumbled to their cars. Some were clutching their stomachs, others were trying to mask their embarrassment with weak smiles, and a few were exchanging bewildered glances, still unsure of what exactly had just happened. And then there was Karen. Standing off to the side, her face a combination of exhaustion, frustration, and humiliation, Karen looked like a person who had been completely blindsided. The once confident woman who had strutted around my house, boasting about the perfect event she was putting together, now looked like she had been deflated. She was standing alone, away from the remaining guests who were busy collecting their things and heading out, trying to salvage what was left of their evening. Karen's bravado had completely disappeared. In its place was a defeated, almost broken expression. She had been the center of attention for all the wrong reasons that night, and it was a reality she could not escape. In the aftermath of the chaos, Karen had no choice but to accept what had happened. She had tried to manipulate the situation, thinking that by making my house the center of the evening, she could take control and paint herself as the hero of the story. Instead, she became the punchline of a joke that everyone else had been in on except her. The fiery wings that I had served as my secret weapon had not only burned their way through her pride, but had also shattered her illusion of control. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but Karen learned a harsh lesson that night. Never underestimate the person you're trying to outsmart. I couldn't help but take some satisfaction in the way the tables had turned. Karen, who had so eagerly volunteered me as the host and had spread the word about the buffet without my consent, had expected to bask in the glory of a perfectly executed event. Instead, she ended up in a far less glamorous role. Her face flushed red with embarrassment, her dignity scorched by the very heat she had unknowingly invited into the evening. The guests, who had once viewed me as a passive participant in Karen's plans, now saw me in an entirely different light. No longer was I the pushover they had expected me to be. I was the person who had controlled the evening, who had turned the situation around when it seemed like I had no power at all. People who had doubted me, who had perhaps thought I was too meek to make waves, now saw my true nature. The way I had handled the chaos, how I had calmly waited for the right moment to strike, showed them that I was capable of far more than they had imagined. Karen's arrogance had clouded her judgment, and she had underestimated me, an error she would now pay for, both publicly and personally. She hadn't expected me to rise to the challenge and take back control. She hadn't expected me to fight back with something as simple yet devastating as the ghost pepper wings. But I had, and the result was a night that would go down in neighborhood history. As Karen made her way to the exit, her shoulders slumped, her movements slower than usual, I couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. She had come into my Home dictated the terms and tried to turn everything into her personal victory. But in the end, I had turned her own plan into her downfall. She had thought she could push me around, that she could make me the unwitting host of her event. But the fiery chaos she had unknowingly invited had made her the central figure in a way she hadn't anticipated. The lesson she learned that night was simple, yet profound. Never mess with someone who has nothing to lose. Never underestimate the power of a person who is pushed to the edge. I had spent the evening watching her revel in her moment, basking in her misguided sense of control. But I knew better than to let her think she had won. She had crossed a line, assuming I would just go along with her plans without question. And the heat of the evening wasn't just felt in the wings. It was felt in the lessons learned, the moments of humiliation, and the knowledge that she would forever be known as the woman who tried to outsmart the wrong person. For everyone else who had witnessed the night's events, the lesson was equally clear. Never assume you know who's in control. People had watched in real time as Karen's bravado crumbled under the weight of her own arrogance. They saw how easily the situation slipped from her grasp, how quickly the tide turned in my favor. I didn't need to shout or argue. All it took was a well-timed surprise, a carefully executed move, and suddenly I was the one in charge. The crowd, once enamored with Karen's false sense of leadership, now looked at me with new eyes. Their opinions irrevocably changed. As the night wound down and the guests slowly filtered out, I knew that the consequences of this evening would be long-lasting. For Karen, the sting of her humiliation would likely follow her for weeks, maybe even longer. The neighborhood would never let her live it down. But for me, it was about more than just the chaos I had created. It was about reclaiming my power and showing that I wouldn't be pushed around, especially not by someone like Karen. The lesson was clear to everyone who had been part of this fiery spectacle. Never mess with me, and never underestimate the heat I bring to the table. The chaos was over, but the impact of that night would be felt for a long time, and Karen would be the one to bear the brunt of it. If you enjoyed watching Karen's downfall and the chaos that unfolded, make sure to subscribe to the HOA Stories for more wild, unpredictable stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. From neighborhood drama to epic showdowns, we've got it all. Don't miss out. Hit that notification bell to stay updated, and be the first to know when new stories drop. Trust us, you won't want to miss what's coming next.